September 1943. High above the scorching deserts of North Africa, a formation of German Messerschmitt fighters climbs toward altitude, hunting for Allied bombers. They're veterans of the Afrika Korps, confident, disciplined, deadly. They've survived 2 years of brutal combat. They own these skies. Then one of them simply disappears. No warning, no radio call, just gone. His wingman banks hard, scanning desperately. Nothing. Empty sky. The formation tightens, eyes searching for the threat they can't see. 30 seconds later, another Messerschmitt explodes in a fireball so sudden the pilot never knew what killed him. Panic. The German flight leader screams into his radio, demanding to know where the attacks are coming from. No one answers because no one knows. They're being hunted by something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. A fighter attacking from directly below, from the sun, from Engel's doctrine, says are suicide. They're facing a pilot who fights like he's trying to get himself killed, except he never dies. What the Germans didn't know, what Allied command was desperately trying to hide, was that this ghost wasn't following any doctrine at all. He was a 26-year-old Australian who'd been court-martialed twice, grounded 3 times, and declared mentally unfit for combat by 2 different psychiatric evaluators. A man so reckless his own squadron mates refused to fly with him. And he was about to become the highest-scoring Allied ace in the Mediterranean theater using tactics so insane they'd be banned after the war. This is the story of Flight Lieutenant James Mad Jack Crawford and the death wish that made him unkillable. To understand how one pilot could terrorize an entire theater, you need to understand the Desert War. By 1943, the North African campaign had become a brutal stalemate. Rommel's Afrika Korps and the British 8th Army had been trading the same strips of sand for 2 years. The air war was just as vicious. German pilots in their Bf-109s and FW-190s were among the best in the Luftwaffe, seasoned killers who'd learned their trade over France and Russia. James Crawford should never have been among them. He'd grown up in rural Queensland, Australia, the youngest of 6 brothers. His father was a cattleman who drank too much, and his mother died when James was 12. He learned to fly at 17, working odd jobs to pay for lessons at a tiny airfield outside Brisbane. His instructors noted 2 things: natural talent that bordered on genius and complete disregard for safety regulations. When war broke out, Crawford enlisted immediately. The Royal Australian Air Force tested him, saw the raw ability, and sent him to advanced fighter training. That's where the problem started. Crawford didn't just bend rules, he shattered them. He flew unauthorized aerobatics over civilian areas. He engaged in mock dogfights at altitudes considered suicidal. He routinely landed with fuel tanks reading empty because he'd pushed missions past their safety margins. His commanding officer wrote in his evaluation, "This pilot possesses exceptional flying skills, but lacks the judgment necessary for combat command. Recommend assignment to transport duties where his recklessness poses minimal risk." Crawford was furious. He didn't want to ferry supplies. He wanted to fight. He appealed the decision, failed, appealed again. Finally, a desperate squadron leader in North Africa, short on pilots after brutal losses, accepted him with one condition: Crawford would fly under strict supervision, and any deviation from orders would result in immediate grounding. Crawford arrived in Libya in June 1943 and was assigned to fly Spitfire Mark Verses. The Spitfire was a beautiful machine, agile and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. But in North Africa, British pilots faced a problem. The German Bf-2109 could outclimb them at altitude, and the FW-190 was faster in a dive. Standard doctrine emphasized maintaining altitude advantage and engaging only when conditions favored the Spitfire's superior turning ability. Crawford looked at that doctrine and decided it was written by cowards. On his 3rd combat mission, he broke formation without authorization and dove alone into a group of 6 German fighters. His squadron leader screamed orders to return. Crawford ignored him. What happened next became legend. Instead of engaging in a conventional dogfight, Crawford did something that made no tactical sense. He flew straight toward the German formation, head-on, guns blazing. This violated every rule of air combat. Head-on passes gave both pilots maybe 2 seconds of firing opportunity, while closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Miss, and you've wasted ammunition and position. Worse, there was significant risk of collision. But Crawford had calculated something nobody else had. German pilots, veterans who'd survived years of combat, had survival instincts. They would break off early to avoid collision. Crawford didn't have survival instincts. Or rather, he'd learned to suppress them so completely he appeared suicidal. He held his course until the last possible microsecond, firing constantly, while the German pilots flinched and broke formation. He destroyed one Bf-109 in the initial pass, damaged another, and scattered the entire formation. Then he climbed back to altitude, completely alone against 5 angry Germans who now wanted him dead specifically. Standard doctrine said he should disengage, run for home. Crawford attacked again. For 8 minutes, he fought alone against overwhelming odds, using every trick he'd developed through hundreds of hours of unauthorized aerobatics. He flew his Spitfire past its design limits, pulling G-forces that should have caused blackout, executing maneuvers that stressed the airframe to near failure. He destroyed a second German fighter and damaged a third before his ammunition ran out. Only then did he disengage, diving for the deck and flying home at treetop level, his Spitfire trailing smoke from multiple hits. He landed with a shredded tail section and fuel for maybe 2 more minutes of flight. His squadron leader was waiting, furious, ready to ground him permanently for the reckless display. Then the gun camera footage was reviewed. Crawford had achieved a 2-to-1 kill ratio while outnumbered 6-to-1, using tactics nobody had seen before. The squadron leader's fury turned to baffled respect. He filed a report recommending Crawford for disciplinary action and simultaneously for a commendation. High Command was equally confused. Over the next 3 months, Crawford refined his insane methodology. He developed a reputation among German pilots as the Veractor, the crazy one, who attacked from impossible angles and never, ever broke off first in a head-on pass. Luftwaffe pilots started recognizing his Spitfire and actively avoiding engagement. His tactics were simple and terrifying. First, he always attacked from a position of disadvantage, using the element of surprise that came from appearing where no sane pilot would be. He'd attack from below, where the sun made him nearly invisible. He'd attack during the enemy's attack run, when they were focused on bombers. He'd attack lone stragglers and entire formations with equal disregard for odds. Second, he exploited the psychological warfare of apparent fearlessness. German pilots who'd survived against conventional opponents found themselves rattled by an enemy who seemed genuinely suicidal. They'd break formation, waste ammunition on defensive fire, make mistakes trying to counter an opponent whose next move violated all tactical logic. Third, Crawford had an instinctive understanding of deflection shooting that bordered on supernatural. He could calculate lead angles in his head while pulling 7 gigaseconds in a vertical climb, firing bursts that connected with uncanny accuracy. His ammunition efficiency was extraordinary. While average pilots required several hundred rounds per kill, Crawford's ratio was closer to 50. By November 1943, he had 15 confirmed kills. His squadron mates called him Mad Jack, a nickname that captured both his apparent insanity and his inexplicable survival. He'd been shot down once, bailing out over Allied territory. He'd crash-landed twice, walking away both times. His Spitfire was patched and repaired so many times the ground crew joked it was more filler than original airframe. But Crawford's recklessness had consequences beyond his own survival. In December, he led a flight of 4 Spitfires against a German formation. Following his aggressive tactics, the flight achieved multiple kills but lost to aircraft. Both pilots were killed. The squadron leader finally had enough justification to ground Crawford permanently. The psychiatric evaluation was damning. The doctor wrote, "Flight Lieutenant Crawford displays symptoms consistent with profound death wish, possibly stemming from childhood trauma. He exhibits no appropriate fear response to mortal danger. His continued survival is statistical anomaly, not evidence of tactical superiority. Recommend permanent grounding and psychiatric treatment." Crawford was devastated, not by the diagnosis, but by the grounding. He argued, pleaded, and finally went over his commander's head directly to Group Headquarters. His appeal landed on the desk of Air Vice Marshal Hugh Lloyd, a hard-nosed commander who cared about results more than protocols. Lloyd reviewed Crawford's record. 15 kills in 6 months, 0 friendly fire incidents, multiple bomber formations successfully defended. Then Lloyd did something unprecedented. He called Crawford into his office and asked one question: "If I let you fly again, will you teach other pilots your methods?" Crawford agreed immediately. Lloyd lifted the grounding with conditions. Crawford would fly only with volunteer wingmen who understood the risks. He would conduct training seminars on his unorthodox tactics, and if his casualty per kill ratio declined, he'd be grounded permanently. Crawford returned to combat in January 1944 with a new role: tactical innovator. He began teaching select pilots his head-on attack methodology, his exploitation of sun position, his calculated aggression. Not everyone could learn it. The techniques required suppressing survival instincts that kept most pilots alive, but a handful who mastered Crawford's approach became devastatingly effective. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early 1944 mention increasing encounters with Allied fighters employing selbstmörderisch Taktik, suicidal tactics. They struggled to counter an approach that violated their own tactical assumptions. Their doctrine assumed rational opponents who valued survival. Crawford had built a system around apparent irrationality. By March 1944, Crawford's personal tally reached 26 kills. He'd become the highest-scoring Allied pilot in the Mediterranean theater. But the war was changing. The Africa Corps had surrendered. The focus shifted to Italy and eventually France. Crawford's squadron was reassigned to support the Italian campaign, flying ground attack missions that offered fewer opportunities for aerial combat. Crawford hated ground attack. Strafing German positions meant flying low and slow, exposed to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. There was no room for the vertical aerobatics and high-speed maneuvering that defined his fighting style. On his 4th ground attack mission, his Spitfire took heavy flak damage. He crash-landed in Allied territory, suffering compression fractures in his spine. The injury should have ended his career. Doctors said he'd never fly combat again. The spinal damage made high-G maneuvers excruciating. Crawford spent 3 months in recovery, then returned to his squadron and declared himself fit for duty. His commander ordered a medical evaluation. Crawford passed by lying about his pain levels and taking enough painkillers to function. He flew 6 more combat missions before the pain became unbearable mid-flight. He landed, barely, and finally admitted defeat. The war was ending anyway. Germany was collapsing. There were no more targets in his theater worthy of the risk. In May 1945, James Crawford's combat career ended with 28 confirmed victories and a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross that would take 3 years to be approved because command still couldn't decide if he was a hero or a maniac. After the war, Crawford returned to Australia and disappeared from public life. He never gave interviews, never attended veteran reunions, never discussed his combat record. He worked as a commercial pilot, then as a flight instructor, teaching aerobatics to civilians with the same passionate intensity he'd brought to combat. He died in 1983 at age 66 in a car accident, killed instantly when a drunk driver crossed the centerline on a rural Queensland road. The man who'd survived hundreds of combat missions, who'd been shot down, crashed, and wounded multiple times, who'd fought a personal war against the Luftwaffe, using tactics that shouldn't have worked. Died because someone else made a mistake. His obituary mentioned his war service in one sentence. Most Australians had never heard of him. His 28 victories were unspectacular compared to the top German and British aces with double or triple his count. But those numbers missed the point. Crawford's contribution wasn't the kills. It was proving that conventional tactical doctrine had blind spots that could be exploited by someone willing to appear insane. Post-war analysis of his methods revealed something fascinating. What looked like suicidal aggression was actually calculated risk-taking based on deep understanding of both aerodynamics and human psychology. Crawford had recognized that survival instinct made pilots predictable. By apparently lacking that instinct, he became unpredictable, forcing opponents into defensive reactions that created opportunities. Modern fighter doctrine incorporates some of Crawford's innovations, though sanitized and systematized. High-speed, high-angle attacks from disadvantageous positions. Exploitation of sun and altitude for surprise. Aggressive head-on passes that force enemy defensive reactions. But modern pilots train for these tactics with sophisticated simulation and gradually increasing risk exposure. Crawford developed them through trial and error while being shot at. The deeper lesson is about innovation under constraints. Crawford wasn't physically exceptional. His Spitfire wasn't superior to German fighters. He didn't have numerical advantage. What he had was willingness to question assumptions that everyone else accepted as fundamental truth. The assumption that altitude advantage was necessary. The assumption that outnumbered pilots should disengage. The assumption that head-on passes were too dangerous. By rejecting those assumptions and accepting risks others found unacceptable, Crawford created tactical advantages that compensated for every material disadvantage he faced. He proved that psychology and unpredictability could be as valuable as superior technology or numbers. He demonstrated that sometimes the only way to win is to fight like you've already lost everything worth protecting. His squadron mates interviewed decades later still remembered him with mixture of awe and discomfort. One described Crawford as the bravest or most broken man I ever met, and I never figured out which. Another said Crawford made everyone around him feel like cowards, even when they were risking their lives daily. A third simply noted, Jack fought like he was already dead. That's what made him impossible to kill. Perhaps that's the real story. Not the victories or the tactics or the controversy over whether he was hero or madman. The real story is about a man so damaged by something nobody ever fully understood that he found peace only in circumstances where death was imminent. And in seeking that peace, he accidentally became one of the most effective tactical innovators of the air war. James Crawford never wanted to be remembered. He refused medals he considered unearned. He never discussed his war beyond acknowledging he'd served. But his ghost lives on in every fighter pilot who learns that sometimes the winning move looks like suicide. That psychological warfare matters as much as material superiority, and that the most dangerous opponent is the one who isn't afraid to die. Mad Jack Crawford. 28 confirmed victories. Court-martialed twice. Grounded 3 times. Declared mentally unfit by psychiatrists. Feared by Germans who never learned his real name. It's forgotten by history that prefers heroes who fit comfortable narratives. And absolutely, undeniably unkillable until the war that gave his life meaning finally ended and left him with nothing left to prove.